Welcome back, friends. Today I got a special treat for you. A YZ250F build. I don't know, I do a lot of Yamahas for whatever reason, but this particular Yamaha runs. It will not start with the Kickstarter, although it pushes over. It just seems like it's really low compression. It does seem to run well without any noises, bangs, clacks, or booms. The idle is really high, so this carburetor is going to need to be top to bottom rebuilt, guaranteed. Well, y'all know the drill at this point. I'm going to have to pull this engine out. I'm going to check the top end over real good. However, there is no fifth gear on this bike. As soon as you put it in fifth, she just revs up and clacks real bad. No pull.
That's top fifth gear right there. She just grinds and grinds in fifth gear, not going anywhere.
So there's definitely going to be damaged gears inside of this transmission. The clutch drags a little bit, so we're going to need to replace that. The fork seals are bad. Front and rear wheel bearings are bad. Spokes are loose on the rear wheel. Chain and sprockets are destroyed. Rear tire. I think the radiator's bent. I just want to stop now. Now, before I start tearing the bike apart, let's take a walk around just so you can see how bad this thing is. I don't feel anything in the steering stem, which is unusual for these. Very common for the front wheel bearings to be bad on the Yamahas. The fork seals are toast. The owner gave me a set of brand new fork seals in the package, so I'm going to have to get that done. And front brake's got a couple rides left on them. The professional mechanics have been on it. It's got much larger bolt heads. The carburetor boot is toast. He also gave me one of those. The shifter's loose and bent a little bit, but that's an easy fix. A pair of pliers. This radiator on this side here is sitting way back, so this thing's crushed probably pretty good. I'm not sure if we'll be able to get that back where it belongs without damaging it. That chain and sprockets are just completely worn. Never had a drop of lubrication in their entire life. So that is spoke play, and it's got so much I can't even tell if the wheel bearings are bad. Now, Joro season is over here in North Georgia, but there's a hell of a spider web underneath here. It pretty much costs more in zip ties than it would have to replace the fender. The rear brakes are not in bad condition. The rear tire could probably have one more run around the track. However, it does have some pretty good dry rotting and cracking. I may or may not replace this depending on where we are on this build. The chain adjuster is just about out to maximum here. It shows how stretched this chain is. Rear brakes work fine. I don't know if this thing was sitting outside. It's definitely got some rust on the bolts. The rear shock probably could use a nitrogen charge. The kicker has definitely seen better days. And again, depending on where the budget is, we'll see what we do with that. Well, on the plus side, it's got a new set of throttle cables, so that's something we don't need to buy. But at this point here, we're going to have to just pull this engine out, get the top end apart, everything measured as we do, and then we're going to have to split the cases and take a good look at this transmission and find out why we have no fifth gear. Well, we've certainly been in this position before, so we know what we need to do. Let's get her torn down. I don't know why I bother. They never come out. Never. Looks like a reusable filter. Super clean. The clutch doesn't look that bad, but I am going to replace it anyway. It just did not feel correct. None of these tabs have been messed with. I don't think this bottom end's ever been apart. Normally I'd leave the transmission in here and clean these cases up. Actually, these cases are in really good condition, clean on the inside. However, since we have to pull the transmission apart anyway, I'll start getting this shift drum apart on this side. All right, these cases are ready to be split. Let's get the top end apart. Now we'll get her up on top dead center on the compression stroke so we can get these cams apart. Cams are in great shape. Well, all right, head looks like it's in pretty good shape. Well, I'm going to clean all this up, and then I'm going to check these valves to make sure that they're seating properly, and we'll probably pull these apart and do new valve seals in it as well. The cylinder looks pretty good. I don't see any damage to the Nika sill at all. Measure this up, see if we can reuse it. It honestly doesn't look like this engine's ever been apart. Critical, you always want to double check to make sure you get all your case bolts out. These dowel pins will stick in the case sometimes. They just need a little persuasion. There's definitely some metal down in here. Probably be expecting it. All the bearings except for this bearing right here, which is very common. I think every single one of these I have to replace this bearing. Crankshaft feels really good. Nice and tight, no play whatsoever. The cam chain teeth are in good shape and not saw teeth, which is fantastic. So here's our pickup screen. Okay, here's the moment of truth. Let's go ahead and get this transmission out. what we're looking for. And I'm seeing a little bit of damage right there on our shift drum. We're looking for any chips or gouges or any damage that you can see to any of these slots. So obviously the shift drum has got an issue. Bearings all feel really good. All right, let's take a look at these gear stacks. These teeth right here are rounded over terribly and totally damaged where they go down and mesh up. Another spot on these Yamahas that you want to pay really good particular attention to is where the shift forks go into the cases. You know, make sure that they slide freely, there's no binding. If there's damage inside of any of these slides or these holes where the slides go, sometimes these can get cocked on an angle and cause shifting issues. So with this transmission, I'm going to go ahead and say this bent shift fork, the damage to this drum, and then the damage to the gear dogs is going to be our problem and why this thing is not engaging properly. Luckily enough, used transmissions for these things are super cheap. Now I don't have enough power to turn this thing like the engine does. I want to show you kind of what's going on here. You see there's a lot of slop on your shift drum right here, and this gear is wanting to come up and the clutch dogs are pulling out of the gear. So when you really put the torque to it, this whole piece is coming up and it's just slipping on that gear. Oh, now comes the time to start measuring this piston and cylinder. All right, let's see what we got here. I've got 3.030 and 0.0315 to 3.0319. So this cylinder is actually in spec. At the top we've got 3.031. So yeah, the cylinder's good. All right, so let's measure our piston here. Yamaha is calling for you to measure 9 millimeters from the bottom edge on the skirt. And my micrometer is not accurate enough to go to thousandths, but I got 3.029, and piston standard size 3.0297 to 3.0303. So while this piston is not out of spec, it's on the lower end of the spec. We're going to go ahead and take these rings off and measure them up. All right, our top ring service limit is 0.50, but we're technically looking at 0.15 to 0.25 millimeters. So let's take a look at the 0.25 and see where we're at. And it slides right through. Let's try a 0.38, and that slides right through, although dragging just slightly. So they're not really at their service limit, but 0.45 does not go in. So I'm going to replace these rings anyway. 0.30 to 0.45. We'll start with 0.45, and it just falls right through. 0.55 falls right through. .80 is a service limit, and that doesn't quite go in. So yeah, they're definitely worn. We're going to go ahead and replace them, hone our cylinder. Probably can reuse this piston. All right, next what we're going to do is check the cylinder head and make sure that these valves are sealing properly on the seats. Easiest way to do this, obviously best way to do this, would be with a cylinder leak down test, but we've already got this engine apart, so we can test this for the most part right here on the bench. We're going to use a solvent like brake clean, but you can use water. What we're looking for is to see if this fluid is leaking out of the valves anywhere. We can look up inside the intake and the exhaust side and see if there's any leakage coming down. So, looks good. I don't see anything leaking around these valves at all. Next thing we're going to do is going to blow some air up inside of here. On both sides. And what we're looking for is bubbles. And that all looks good. So if these valves had a little bit of a leak, this fluid would leak down past it, and also when you blow air in, you'd see bubbles coming up around here. So we're good on this head. We can get it cleaned up and get it prepared to get some valve seals and put back together. Now these aftermarket bearings, they're good bearings. They're Koyo and a hell of a lot cheaper than the OEM one. The only difference is the OEM one has a seal on the inside, not on the outside, where the Koyo has the seals on both sides. Obviously easy to remedy. We'll just pull the seal. And discard it. Now you want to remember, it's critical for the seal side to go in on this case. The old bearing's noisy. Now I'm going to go ahead and get these transmission gear stacks put back together. I'm going to do it in time lapse because this is sort of a family show and nobody needs to hear all the cursing and swearing that will be going on trying to put this together. Yamaha's transmissions are kind of really a pain to put together. Well, that wasn't absolutely terrible. This one actually slid in pretty easily. The problem I find with these transmissions, unlike Kawasaki, Suzuki, and Honda, is that I can't really shift this transmission on the bench to make sure that it's working well unless the two cases halves are together. Reason being is that these rods are supported on both sides by the case, and they just have way too much flex in play when you try to shift this mechanism. So unfortunately, you have to get the cases together before you can even check to make sure the transmission is shifting properly. But I do recommend doing that once you have the cases together before you go too far. Now before you put your case halves back together, a couple critical things here. I want to make sure your oil pump pickup is installed. There is a dowel with an O-ring that must go on. And then your case itself has dowel pins that need to be in. This oil pickup screen requires no gasket or sealer. Being that the bolts are inside of the engine, I will put a little dab of blue Loctite just to keep them from backing out on me. Now at this point we want to go ahead and put our sealer on our case to get these two case halves back together. It's always easier if you can take these dowels out and put them in this side of the case. This way you can get a good even coating, but if not, not a big deal. It's more than likely that you're going to need a crankshaft installation tool to pull this crankshaft through this bearing. Sometimes the case needs a little bit of a tap because these dowels tend to fight you going together. Might be wondering why I have this socket in here. Well, with these Yamahas, this bottom support for the cam chain guide is raised pretty high, so I need something on the other side to counterbalance it. Now that we got this installed, we can go ahead and run this thing through the gears. So when the shift drum is in neutral, we want to make sure we can spin our input shaft while holding our output shaft still. As you can see, our output shaft is not turning. That gives us neutral. Now both shafts are spinning. That's our first gear. Second, third, fourth, and there's our fifth. Now we won't know if this is any good until we get riding on the bike to see if it'll pop out, but this transmission's in great shape, so we shouldn't have any issues. On these shifter pawls, one side is round, one side square. The round side has to go in. And we're going to compress these springs. counterbalance shaft. Remember to line up this flat spot so it can bypass the crankshaft. This gear will only go on one way, so you can't make a mistake. This crankshaft gear will also only go on the shaft one way. However, it does need to be lined up with the counterbalance shaft. If you look at the splines on the crankshaft, there's one that's shorter than all the other ones. That's going to line up with this inner dot. So once you got that started, you're going to notice that there's another dot on the outer gear. You want to bring that all the way over. And also your counterbalance shaft will also have a dot on it. You want to line those two up. And the two dots are across from each other. These two are in sync properly. Then this gear doesn't really matter which direction it goes. Before you install your new clutch, soak the friction disc in oil for about a half an hour. Helps for that cork material to absorb some of that oil. Alright, got the bottom end built. Nothing but up from here. Some of these chains can be pretty expensive, but there's really no excuse on a Yamaha. I mean, a factory OEM chain is like $22. Ultimately, we're going to torque these head bolts to 27 foot-pounds. I'm going to do them in a couple stages. In other words, 10, 20, 27. So obviously off camera, I pulled this head apart, cleaned everything up real good, put some new valve seals in it, and shimmed the cams properly. Well, I went ahead and rebuilt this carburetor top to bottom. The complaint on it was that it had a very high idle. He couldn't get it adjusted outright. There was a couple of issues. All the mid-body gaskets on this thing were hard as plastic. There's an O-ring on the slide plate that was broken and damaged, which will directly have an impact on how this thing idles. Also, it was not jetted anywhere near correctly. So I hope we got it correct now. This thing's got a ton of compression. But I've been here before, so let's see what happens. There's no spark. It's not even giving me anything. Okay, getting no spark. That's part of the problem here. Well, I disconnected the kill switch, tried another CDI, tried another ignition coil, nothing, still no spark. We got to have a bad connection here somewhere, or the stator just failed for whatever reason. All right, let's test these stator coils and find out what's going on. First thing we want to do is check this pickup coil. The pickup coil tells the CDI when to trigger for spark. Positive will go to the red lead, negative will go to the white lead. And what we're looking for is between 248 and 372 ohms at 68 degrees Fahrenheit. So 284, we definitely fall within that spec. The pickup coil is good. Next thing we're going to do is check our first charging coil. That's going to be the next two leads, green and brown. Brown is going to be your positive. Green is going to be your negative. And what we're looking for here is 720 to 1080 ohms. And there's our problem right there. We have no connection whatsoever. The second charging coil is going to be the last two, pink and black. Pink will be your positive, black will be your negative, and we're looking between 44 and 66 ohms. And we got like 52 ohms. So our first charging coil for some reason is not working. So I got to pull the stator back off and ohm these wires out to find out what happened. There must be a loose connection or a broken wire, because it was working before. So let me take a look at that. This here's your pickup coil, measured out fine. This here is our second charging coil. It's black, pink, measured out fine. Our primary charging coil, which is these three coils, which is going to be the brown to the green, no good. So this coil here has failed. These two are fine. This coil here has failed. I cannot replace it separately, so unfortunately I have to grab a stator for this thing. I don't know what happened because it was a running bike, but is what it is. Well, as it turns out, and it's most unfortunate, I have to get another stator for this thing. Kind of strange, because it was running, obviously. You saw it running. And I didn't do anything but take the stator off and put it on the bench and then reinstall it in the engine. Now I've got a bad coil in it for whatever reason. However, the bike feels like it's got really good compression, so I have high hopes for it. Since I have to wait for the stator and I'm kind of out of time on this, I want to make sure I get a video out for you guys tomorrow. I am going to leave this as a part 1. Tune in next week for the exciting conclusion of the YZ250F build, where we'll get this engine running, get these forks rebuilt, tire replaced, chain and sprockets, and get this thing back on the track for the next guy. I appreciate you watching, as always. If you haven't subscribed yet, please consider doing so. If you enjoyed the video or it helped you out at all, give me a thumbs up. Always happy to hear your comments. So I apologize that I couldn't get this thing running for you in this video, but we'll get it next week for sure. Thanks again, and we'll see you.